the kind of person who usually votes for Democrats but isn't sure if they want to vote or not needs the same level of communication. And you need to think about it as a persuasion conversation. It's not just, I don't know when the election is and I don't know where my polling place is. In a presidential election, folks can figure that out. It's, why should I bother to vote? Thank you for joining us and welcome to a new episode of Power and Flower. I'm John Hagner.
And I am Seth Maskett.
We are a political scientist and a political consultant who are trying to understand and explain what is going on in U.S. politics, and we also care deeply about pastries. One of the ironies of doing what Seth and I do for a living, talking about politics, is that when people are most interested in what we have to say, we have the least actual information to share, right? Right after the election, everyone wants to know what happened. But votes take a really long time to be counted, and then they take even longer to be understood. There are exit polls that have been happening and they can add some details, but they're really only accurate when they're weighted to the final outcome. And they can often be really misleading and not line up with what the results that we see on the ground. So often what happens is that people rush to answer the questions about what happened in an election the day after or the week after before anybody really knows the answer. And usually that is a data-free adventure, right? They are pulling their favorite theory off the shelf. Whatever they were going to say before the election is what they say after the election, because we just don't have better information. California votes alone take a month to count. So by the time we have actual data to answer what happened in an election, conventional wisdom has been set and most people have already moved on. But it is important to understand what happened, and it's worth taking the time to do it right. This isn't something that can be rushed. And what I believe in to be the most definitive version of what happened in the 2024 election was released last week. And this is a tool that Democratic operatives really rely on as sort of the definitive answer to what happened in the election. It's a report put out by a company called Catalist, which is Catalist. There's no Y in this one, which is a voter file company and analytics operation based out of DC. And they do a really careful and really thorough breakdown of what happened in every election since 2016 they've been doing it.
So we'll post I just want to say we'll post a link to that on the blog, and so people can read through. But I'm curious, what are the key findings in this report?
Yeah, so the key findings in the report are that overall turnout was high, right? That one of the hallmarks of the Trump era in American politics is that a lot more people are voting than used to. So overall turnout was slightly down from 2020 levels, but by historic standards was extraordinarily high across the country. It was slightly higher in Republican areas and with Republican voters than in Democrats. I'm sure we can break into more. Another finding was that there were turnout effects, right? Turnout was slightly lower among Democratic communities relative to Republican. Again, still high historically. But the biggest difference between 2020 and 2024 was that a lot of Biden 2020 voters switched their vote to Trump. And that's especially true of young voters, men, voters of color, less frequent voters, urban voters, and voters living outside of battleground states, which is a long list. And obviously there's a lot of overlap. But yeah, I think the biggest takeaway here, and this sounds really simplistic, but I think it's important to understand, is if the question is, why did Donald Trump win? The answer is white people. If the question is, why did Kamala Harris do worse than Joe Biden? The answer is primarily people of color, right? That most people of color vote for Democratic candidates. If people of color were a larger share of the electorate, Democrats would do better, is absolutely true. It is also really true and important to understand that the difference between where Harris was in 2024 versus Biden and where Biden was versus Obama going back is that there's a long-term trend over the last 20 years at least of voters of color moving toward the Republican Party. And that's especially true with younger voters. It's especially true with men. It's doubly true with young men. I think overall, the report goes into great detail in a way that I think has important implications that we should all talk about, that the most consistent voters stayed strong for Harris. The people who vote in every election, the people who are highly engaged, who are paying attention to political news, who are reading the newspaper, who are watching TV, who are watching ads, who vote in every election, those folks stayed really solid for Harris, right? So the people who are going on the internet and sharing their opinion about politics, that's not the problem that Harris had. The challenge is the people who moved away are the much less engaged voters. For the very first time, voters who didn't participate in the election were more likely to be Democrats than Republicans, which is not the, when I learned politics, it was there's a large mass of people who would vote for Dems if they bothered to vote, but a lot of them don't bother to vote. That there were fewer Republicans, but they were better, more engaged voters. That was the world in 2004 when I learned the electoral map of the country. 20 years later, for the first time, according to the Catalist data, that is no longer true. That the people who didn't vote were more likely to be Republican than Democratic. And, it transitions sort of our thinking. We used to think of low turnout favoring Republicans and high turnout favoring Democrats. That math has changed. And it's changed in large part because less engaged voters, the kind of voters who may not register, if they register, they may not vote. If they vote, they may vote only sometimes, are more likely to be supportive of Trump and Republican candidates, which I think is a really important and hard thing to get your brain around if you expect a world where high turnout almost always helps Dems. Um, uh, One of the things that we see here really clearly in the report, and I think again has big implications, is that battleground states perform differently than the rest of the country. That
Mhm.
Harris did a lot better relative to Joe Biden's baseline in the 7 states where the campaign spent money. So Arizona, Nevada, Georgia, North Carolina, Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania. Those 7 states held up much, much better. And that's true demographically, it's true geographically, it's true just in the election results, right? The state that shifted the most from Biden to Harris was actually New Jersey, right? Far from the battleground, not seeing the ads, not getting the communication. That moved 9 points against the Democrats. That the Where the campaign engaged, they seem to have done a lot better. And so, I think after the 2016 election, we all sort of internalized this as the country wanted to vote for Hillary Clinton, but poorly distributed voters in the swing states meant that the battleground states were more conservative than the rest of the country, and they narrowly voted for Trump because of the campaign making decisions in terms of where to go, what to do, where to spend money. That's absolutely not what happened here. So you can have as many opinions as you want about Kamala Harris's campaign and the campaign in general, but the data in this report suggests that where the campaign was engaged, where people were spending time and money, where Harris was holding rallies, where Trump was holding rallies, where both campaigns were on television, Harris did better by 3 to 4 points better. So this isn't a question, I think, of campaign tactics. And as Democrats in particular are trying to understand what happened and what to do from it, that's a really important and frankly scary lesson, right? That the tactics that we did on this campaign worked. The problem is the country had moved so far away from us that adding 3 or 4 points in the battleground states relative to the baseline wasn't enough to win, right? Um, that is a much bigger and scarier problem, but it's also a problem that gets way beyond campaign tactics. A lot of the spaces that I'm in, we're focused on optimization, right? Like, how do we get our ad to be seen by a few more voters? How do we get our message to be a little bit more persuadable? We're looking at tinkering around the edges of making our tools more efficient. That's work that the Democrats have been taking seriously for 20 years, and it's working, right? And it works, right? Where we have the ability to tinker on the edges, we can get an advantage. The problem is, while we were doing that, the whole terrain shifted away from us in a way that uh, we can't optimize our way out of. Right? That the idea that the country as a whole moved 4 points on voter on partisan self-identification, that's not a problem that you're going to solve with a better ad or a more efficient knock list. That's a problem of governance. That's a problem of big picture strategy. That starts to get very quickly out of everybody's pay grade. So, Seth, I know you had some time with the report. Did you notice anything different, or would you categorize any different key findings?
Um, there's a there's a few things I wanna just ask you about here because I might have some slightly different interpretations of things. But first of all, just what I want to say, like a lot of like the research I do is on narratives. It's on the stories that people interested in politics tell about why an election came out as it did, usually right after the election. And those are usually pretty data free. Those are, people just have their opinions about why a candidate lost. Often they had that opinion before the election even happened. And so I really appreciate us, taking this time to go through the data and the work you're doing on this. Um, so one thing I want to ask you about the, a lot of this report is about comparing how Kamala Harris did in 2024 relative to how Joe Biden did in 2020.
We
That's important. Like we see some short-term and long-term trends about like where the Democratic Party is losing ground, where Trump is exciting people. Um, what it doesn't necessarily tell us is like why Kamala Harris or versus why the Democratic Party lost the election, right? So, a lot of people will interpret from this, well, okay, this happened because Kamala Harris was a bad candidate. And I don't know that it necessarily tells us that. So, one of the things I wanted to know, do we have a sense of how Kamala Harris did relative to how Joe Biden would have done had he stayed on the ticket? Did she save some of the voters that Biden was likely to lose? Was it the same? Was it pretty much the same regardless of who the candidate was? Is this something that we can tell?
Yeah, it's a great question, and without the alternative history of knowing, I think it will
Right.
always be speculative. Yeah, I think my read on the polling over the summer is that Biden was losing going into the debate. He was down a couple points. After the debate, he went down a lot more, but Trump didn't necessarily pick those voters up. That what
Mhm.
happened, according to the data that I was tracking back then, is about 1 out of 10 Joe Biden voters moved from supporting Biden to being undecided in the sort of immediate debate aftermath, right? That he lost about 10% of his vote share. So he went from about 46% down to about 42% in the data that I was tracking. But again, Trump didn't pick those voters up. They moved undecided. Once Harris got in the race, she got those undecided voters back, right? And maybe a few more people who've been undecided on Biden versus Trump, popped up her way for the first sort of excited couple months, and then a lot of those folks chipped away again.
Mm.
The most interesting thing about the candidate quality question here is that if you didn't know who these candidates were and you said looked at just black support and black turnout in this report in 2020 and 2024, you would never guess that the candidate in 2024 was a black woman and the candidate in 2020 was a white man, right?
Mhm.
That Biden did better with black voters in terms of both turnout and percentage than Harris did, I think really gets at a lot of the conventional wisdom that at least Democrats have about candidate demographic effects. We did see Harris's numbers holding up better with women than men, so you may have seen some gender impact there, where a male candidate might have lost equal numbers of votes with men and women. But yeah, I think that the cake was so well baked, to get to an analogy that works for us as analysts and as bakers, that people had made up their minds about the Biden administration, and I think that the disastrous debate for Biden meant that his trajectory had changed and it was getting worse, and so that's why the candidate switch mattered. But
Mhm.
that once the candidate switch happened, that Harris sort of got back to the equilibrium that had existed in May and June, which was that was a race that Biden was losing, right? And I think everyone looking at carefully at that polling, it was clear that Biden was losing that race then, which is why the campaign wanted to have the debate early. They wanted to sort of shake up the status quo because the status quo wasn't working. But again, I think the it's harder to separate out if Harris was a good candidate. I think
Mhm.
it's easier to separate out that Harris ran a good campaign, because where she ran that campaign made a difference, right? She did
Right.
better in the swing states. So now that campaign was mostly built by Biden. It was headquartered in Wilmington because it was Joe Biden's campaign. So she didn't mess it up. But I don't know that there's an answer to the question of if she's a good candidate in this data. I think that that's a question that Democratic primary voters will probably get to weigh in on in 2028, if she
Mhm.
chooses to run again. Um, yeah. I mean, do you have any different data? Do you have a hypothesis on that question?
Um, well, I was trying to find, like a solid poll, from, just before Biden dropped out to get a sense of, how he was polling versus how Kamala Harris did in the election. And I'm not sure I have all the right data at this point yet. But just preliminarily, what I'm finding is that it doesn't actually look that different, which I have a hard time squaring with the fact that suddenly, like, the Democratic ticket was doing about 5 points better once it switched to her.
Yeah.
Um, So I'm not sure, but it looks like she probably lost a little bit of ground among men, picked up a little bit of ground among women, and and was probably going to do about as well on among black voters, among Latino voters as Biden was going to do.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think it's, part of the Democrats were really excited in the candidate switch and they were answering polls.
Hmm.
And I do think that part of the like, oh, everything has changed was just the differential poll response stuff. That if you
Sure.
called a Democrat a week before the debate, they were a lot less likely to want to talk to a stranger about politics than they were the week after the candidate switch, right? That,
Mm,
I live in Minneapolis in a very, very liberal neighborhood in a liberal city. Um, and the week after the candidate switch, there were people making free Kamala Harris posters in the park and handing them out to people, and everybody who walked by took one. And there was this excitement that a month earlier you would have never seen people making a free Joe Biden poster in the park. But all of those people who took that Kamala Harris poster would have voted for Joe Biden. They just wouldn't have been as excited about it, and they
mm,
would have been less likely to talk about it to a stranger. So I do think that, you know one of the real values of this Catalist report is that this is not depending on polling. It's not depending on people responding to surveys. This is looking at actual turnout and then precinct level and the most granular level vote data, and then squaring that against the demographics that we know, which I think gets us past some of those challenges and limitations with polling and more toward a better sense of what actually happened.
mm. Okay. Um, that's really interesting. Now, I wanted to ask you, there was something in what you were talking about in your analysis. There was really fascinating material on voter turnout.
Yeah.
And there's a great graph in this report that just shows the relationship between turnout and the percent voting Republican, and it's just this. It's quite remarkable. Just the shift across the board. I wanted to ask about this, and you had said that basically like we might be living in a world now where higher turnout benefits Republicans, and which is opposite from our previous world. There was a study put out, I think about a month or two ago. Adam Bonica and a number of other political scientists. I'll link to it in our Substack. They were looking at what data we had at the time on exit polls and polling, and came up with the argument that it isn't necessarily that higher turnout benefits Republicans. It's basically that Republicans were just far better at mobilizing their voters last year than Democrats were at mobilizing theirs, or conversely, the Democrats were just really unenthusiastic about turning out, and campaigning could only change that so much. That's a somewhat different interpretation of the results, and I'm curious if you buy that. Does this mean any different as an interpretation about how to go forward?
Yeah, I'm not sure that I buy it, in part because, again, of the distinction between the battleground states and the non-battleground states. That, Republicans weren't turning out their voters in New Jersey, because no one was trying to turn out their voters in New Jersey because nobody, unfortunately, the way that American elections work is that your votes only count if you live in one of those seven states, and other than that,
Right.
your background noise. So I think that assigning that to like a campaign tactical edge is the wrong way of thinking about it. I think that, it's more Republicans were more likely to vote. I think that's a true fact.
Hmm.
I don't know that that is something that the Republicans did as much as that is the reality of where we were in 2024. And I think that, one of the useful things that the Catalyst report does, and it's a direction that we've been moving for a long time. Again, when I learned how to do politics in 2004, we talked about having really different strategies for persuasion of like, this person's going to vote, make sure they vote for you, versus turnout being this person would only vote for Democrats, but they might skip an election. In presidential races with really high turnout, that distinction doesn't matter that much, right? Because
Hmm.
the kind of people who we need to both persuade and get people to vote at the same time, that there isn't a radically different message for somebody who might not vote, or the kind of person who usually votes for Democrats but isn't sure if they want to vote or not needs the same level of communication. And you need to think about it as a persuasion conversation. It's not just, I don't know when the election is and I don't know where my polling place is. In a presidential election, folks can figure that out. It's, why should I bother to vote? And I think there are a
Hmm.
lot of Democrats in that why should I bother to vote bucket, in a way that there weren't that many Republicans. That, Republicans told themselves a story about how the great golden era of Trump won was sullied and taken apart by Biden. Democrats didn't have the same sort of counter story. People were really unhappy with the administration. They were really unhappy with inflation. They're really unhappy with everything that was happening in the world. So there was a lot less enthusiasm.
Sure. Um, yeah, I want to actually ask you about like what was motivating people either to turn out or to not turn out or to change their party leanings. Like I'm always really hesitant to, to buy what people say about the issues that mobilize them in a poll, just because we know that voters tend to be really bad about knowing why they're doing things. And they'll just sort of apply something post hoc that makes sense to them. But I'm curious, like the fact that young people voted much more Republican this election than they did in 2020. Is that about Gaza? Is that about inflation? Do we have some sense for that from this data?
Yeah, I it's it's hard to know.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's no definitive. This is a question for polling, and it's a question for focus groups. Um, I think Gaza is certainly part of it. I do think that what we're seeing here is not high rates of abstentionism among young people. It wasn't what a lot of the if you go on Twitter or X, people are like, oh, I'm going to vote third party because of Gaza. We didn't really see a spike in third party votes among young people.
Right.
It was
Right.
people voting for Trump. So, if folks voted for Trump because they wanted a different outcome in Gaza, then those were not necessarily very well informed voters.
Right.
Um, so I do think that it's one of the challenge. There's a story that left wing people often tell themselves that the reason the Democrats lose election is because a lot of very politically aware and engaged left wing people sit out the election because they're unhappy with the choices. And that what Democrats should do to win is to adopt those left wing positions. And then all of a sudden, these millions of left wing people who sometimes sit out elections will participate. There is no data to support that. There is never any data to support that. It is a fairy tale that people like to tell themselves because it means that they don't have to change anything that they believe. So that version of Gaza did not happen, right? There was not a world where there were millions of progressive young people in Michigan and Wisconsin and Pennsylvania who would have voted if Kamala Harris had adopted their exact language on Gaza, but didn't. I do think that Gaza was part of the unhappiness with the Democratic Party that made folks say, we don't trust these people. They're not standing up for us. Let's give somebody else a chance.
Mhm.
But again, that wasn't a well-informed left-wing abstentionism as much as it was, I'm tired of this. But I think if you look at areas with high Muslim populations, there's the town of Hamtramck in Michigan is a majority Muslim community, Dearborn, other places. You see Trump did orders of magnitude better in 2024 than in 2020. It really stands out. And I think Gaza must be a part of that. But again, it was people choosing to vote for Donald Trump, not choosing to have a principled objection to the entire process.
Right. Right. And yeah, like I mean, we know from a lot of evidence that when people are bothered by the way things are, they will blame the sitting president. They'll blame the current party in charge, regardless of what the out party is going to do, or maybe they're going to do nothing differently. But they
Well,
just yeah.
I think the other really big part of young people moving right politically is COVID. And I think that
Mm,
even though Donald Trump was president for the entirety of the COVID lockdown period, voters didn't think of him as president. They thought of Democratic governors or Democratic mayors as being in charge. And I think a lot of young people in particular feel very justifiably poorly done by on COVID, right? That,
mhm.
we closed schools and we opened bars, which was exactly the opposite of what we should have been doing. Uh, that a lot of people's high school careers and college careers were radically disrupted, and in a way that will harm them their whole life. And I think that folks blame progressives for that. One of the great irony is that Donald Trump was president the entire time.
All right.
But you know, the key question of the 2024 election was who was president in 2020, and they're
Right.
wrong that they came up with an answer.
Um, so another question for you. Just, looking at the data in this report, we see this trend. And I'm curious, like if assuming the trend over the past three elections say hold, the electorate is actually getting less racially polarized, but actually more polarized along lines of education. And I'm curious how you interpret this. Is this actually a sign of progress as a society, or does this help or hurt? the country? Does this help or hurt the Democratic Party? What do you see here?
This is what I've been wrestling with since I read this report, and I want your answer to this question too. It absolutely hurts the Democratic Party, right? Like the Democratic Party doing worse with voters of color is bad for Democrats. It's bad for the issues that we care about. It makes it harder to win elections, and then once we win elections, it makes it harder to govern. I don't know if it's bad for the country or not. Yeah, as a gay person, I would love if the gay community was a 50-50 fought over demographic, right? I want Republicans to wake up in the morning and think, what can we do to get 50% of the gay vote? Because that would make life better for gay people. They don't do that. And right, like LGBT people are an overwhelmingly Democratic group because there's only one party that's trying to win our votes. So I can see a world where Republicans wake up in the morning and say, what are we going to do to get majority support with black voters? Meaning that they support a bunch of policies that make this country a better place, right? Or that make black communities more likely to thrive, where they wake up saying, how are we going to get Latino voters and Asian voters to support us, changing the way that they govern? I can see that as being a positive thing. I don't know that it is like that's a reality we're seeing right now. But yeah, I think in the short term, it's a disaster for Democrats, without a doubt. I think in the long term, it might mean that sort of racially depolarizing the country is better in outcomes. I think the education polarization is not a good thing on any level. I think we're really struggling right now, and then I think one of the reasons that politics feels so insane in 2025 is that we're living in a world where it's not just education, but it's participation in news consumption, that like just the very act of caring about what's happening politically means you are much more likely to be a Democrat is a system that we cannot sustain itself, right? That
Hmm.
like if the only way you vote Republican is by not paying attention, then the incentives for the Republicans are so perverse. The whole system just can't really function that way. We've got to get back to a place, I think, where well-informed voters, whether they went to college or not, but voters who are paying attention, are active, and are engaged, are 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 not overwhelmingly one party. I think is essential for things to be healthy. But what do you think? Like, does racial depolarization? Do you think that helps the country?
Well, I mean, I don't know. But one of the things I wonder from this is how much of this trend is a Donald Trump effect versus just sort of long term party realignment. And like, I tend to be really skeptical of interpretations that are based solely on who the candidate is. But in Trump's case, it might be a good idea. Like he's a perfect candidate for attracting essentially low information voters, people who don't follow politics closely, people with less of an education, because everyone already knew who he was. He's just wildly famous. No one, he never needed to introduce himself to anyone as a candidate from when he first ran. Um, and so, in some ways, like maybe that doesn't work as much when he's not on the ticket. Like we've seen some evidence from the last two midterm elections that like Republicans haven't fared especially well in those, when he's not on the ballot. Don't know if that will continue in 26 or subsequent elections when he's not on the ballot. Um, but yeah, I think that's one way to think about it. It's still not clear to me. Let me back up. There's no particular reason that say black voters we're always going to vote, very 90% Democratic forever, right? That's been a trend for roughly 50 years. And motivated by a lot of history, a lot of what we saw in the civil rights movement and prior to that, that even among conservative black voters, they have tended to vote very strongly Democratic, simply because like that's what their community does, and it's just believed to be this is part of who you are. So like there was nothing to make sure that that was going to happen forever. Like it's just still shocks me that like now is the time when they start voting more Republican, or that among Latinos that now is the time that they're seeing the Democratic as the less the less sympathetic outcome. That somehow a candidate who is like more likely than any prior presidential candidate since like the mid 1800s, to use very racially explicit, motivated by a lot of racial animus language. And it actually seems to be helping to diversify his coalition. So
And And part of
Still
that,
not sure I get that.
my hot take on this is that very little of this has to do with Trump.
Mhm.
That if you look at long-term data sets, it's very, and you look at, how voters have changed over time, and you take away the years and the candidates' names, you can't really point to a place and say, aha, this is where Trump became the face of the Republican Party.
Right,
But
right.
the Trump perhaps accelerated trends that were already happening. But, I started working in Ohio on campaigns in 2006, long before anybody, Trump had been on anybody's political radar, when he was still, pretending to fire people on TV. And we saw, we got 40% of the vote in a lot of these industrial factory towns in 2006, and then it was 36, and then it was 32, and then it was 28, and then it was, and all of those sort of trends predate Trump. And so I think that a lot of this is Trump became the Republican nominee because he perfectly appealed to the Republican Party, rather than Trump changed the Republican Party into something that works for him. That, you
Uh-huh.
know, pe- I have thought it silly for a long time that folks insist on distinguishing between Trump and good Republicans, or like, it's important, I think, for a lot of commentators and columnists and pundits to convince themselves that there are smart, decent Republicans who don't like what Trump is doing. And we've had some on the show, and those people exist in anecdotes, but they don't really exist in large numbers in the data. But that's because, again, like, the Republican Party was looking for Trump rather than Trump was looking for the Republican Party. And if it hadn't have been Trump, it would have been somebody similar. That sort of anti-elite, anti um big city, yeah, the fact that it's a New York City guy who went to um Wharton or to UPenn and poops in a golden toilet is
Right.
ironic, but the message is what the voters were looking for, and
Yeah.
he saw the market for that. um so, yeah, I think the only thing that really is different in the Trump era in the data is turnout, right? The really clear difference is that once Donald Trump got involved, turnout was supercharged on both sides. That a lot of Republicans wanted to go vote for him, and a lot of Democrats wanted to vote against him. And that is the main sort of change that I think you can attribute to the person of Trump, is that he made people think and talk about politics both in a pro and anti way who didn't before.
Mm. Well, okay. This has been really fascinating. I'm curious if some of our listeners have their own different interpretations of the data. But we've talked about rising turnout. Let's talk about rising dough. S- uh,
Excellent segue.
yes, I'm getting better at these. Uh, I have not been doing a ton of baking lately, but I'm curious what you've been thinking about.
So I need to get your opinion on this, because I this has been a debate in my household for the last
Okay.
week. My beloved fiance Adam, we're getting married 2 weeks from recording this, less than 2 weeks. It is his birthday this week, and this is the third birthday that we've celebrated together. And for each of them, he has asked me to bake a key lime pie. And like, look, key lime pie is good. It is a delicious dessert. I'm not here to disparage the key lime pie in its existence, but it to me is not an appropriate birthday celebration food. Partially because it's really easy, right? Like, the recipes on the side of the key lime juice, you make a graham cracker crust, the whole thing comes together in 20 minutes. It just doesn't feel like a party. Like, I believe firmly that for a party you need a cake.
Mm,
You can have a pie for, a picnic, or a pie for. But obviously he disagrees, and it's his birthday, so he gets what he wants, and
right.
I make the best key lime pie that I can. But do you have an opinion on sort of pie for birthdays?
I mean, I guess I've sort of considered myself a pastry libertarian in the sense that, I believe, live and let live. If this is what the people want, let them have it. On the other hand, I agree with you that, like, yeah, pie. I love pies. Not everyone does. Pies are great. Pies are not festive. They're not for birthdays. They're for holiday dinners and things like that. On top of that, like, I know there's people who just don't like cake, which I don't really understand, but fine. If that's your bag, whatever. But yeah, I think if I were in your situation, I would, this is what he wants. He gets the key lime pie, but I would decorate it really stupidly just to show that that can be done. Just put a lot of icing on it, and
Yeah.
with a really like an embarrassing picture or something like that. Or
The last couple of years, I was like, "Oh, I'm a classically trained pastry chef. I should do this." So, like, I made like fancy meringues that I toasted, and everyone was polite about it, but I could tell they weren't that excited. So this year, I skipped the meringue. I just whipped some cream and dolloped it on, and people said it was the best one I'd ever made. And I'm like, guys,
okay, yeah,
go for it. So but look, love means accepting people's quirks, even when those quirks are being pie for birthday people.
but you could at least like you can use like slivered lime wedges to spell out Catalist or something like that on the pie. I mean,
Well, we were at his parents' cabin this weekend, which is where we usually are on his birthday because it's always around Memorial Day. And they happened to have a 3 and a 7 candle left over from children's birthday parties, so I
oh,
did make the his age 37 on the cake on the pie.
excellent,
But when we get married in a week and a half, we will have proper cakes, so the celebration will be taken care of.
awesome. Thank you for an excellent discussion today, and a great breakdown of some really complex data. I think this has been a really useful conversation, at least for me.
Yeah, and folks should check out the report. The team at Catalyst are brilliant, and I think do a real service by putting this out in public. So everybody should take advantage of that and read and digest it.
Yep, agreed. All right, good talking to you. Take care, and everyone stay safe. Thank you for listening to this episode of Power and Flower. This episode was produced by Eli Maskett. We encourage you to follow and rate this podcast wherever you listen to it. Watch for new episodes at the end of each week.